Welcome to episode 8 of Power Play, where we travel the world to explore the hard truths of the energy transition. This week, I'm taking you to Central Florida to explore a topic that's essential to understanding the past and the future of the energy transition: exponential thinking. How often have you heard a critic of renewable power talk about how it's always only made up a few percentage of global energy consumption, and it'll never really matter versus fossil fuels? You know what? Looking backward, they're right. But I want to show you in this episode what it looks like looking forward, and why I have some confidence in a forecast that renewables will soon produce a very large percentage of world energy. I started my career studying how cracks grow in gas turbine components in jet engines and power plants. Crack growth starts very slowly, but it grows exponentially and eventually can cause very sudden component failure. I learned how to become an exponential thinker during these early years of my career, studying how cracks grow. During the next phase of my career, my role in the energy transition was to work on developing, manufacturing, and commercializing new gas turbine technologies that allowed us to improve fuel efficiency and increase the output of gas turbines. In doing so, we were able to beat the cost of power from coal with a technology that emitted 60% less carbon dioxide than a retiring coal-fired power plant. When hydraulic fracturing came along in 2007 and caused a dramatic drop in the cost of natural gas in the United States, it was off to the races, and we started to see coal-fired power generation replaced by natural gas, causing a substantial drop in carbon emissions in the U.S. power sector. So prior to 2013, my career was pretty focused on natural gas power generation. As we approached the mid-2010s, a pivotal shift was starting to unfold in the energy landscape, prompting a significant transition in my own career. But before we talk about the next phase of my career, let's take a minute to dive deeper into exponential thinking. Exponential thinking is the audacious mindset that challenges us to envision a future where exponential growth has already happened. Exponential growth isn't about adding, it's about multiplying. And we can see an example of exponential growth here in Central Florida. I was recently at the beach near Cape Canaveral on the day of a SpaceX rocket launch, and it occurred to me that a rocket launch is a great example of how exponential growth happens. As we watch a rocket launch from the Cape, initially it seems to move almost sluggishly, struggling to free itself from the grasp of Earth's gravity. But within seconds, its ascent becomes a lot faster. And by the time it reaches the upper atmosphere, it's moving at supersonic speeds, and its speed continues to grow exponentially until it reaches something called main engine cutoff. That's when the first and second stage separate, and there's no increase in speed for a brief time. And then, as the thruster of the second stage lights off, speed begins increasing exponentially again, this time growing less rapidly due to the lower thrust of the second stage. This kind of speed increase before and after main engine cutoff is not linear, it's exponential. Just as a rocket's speed increases exponentially due to the compounding effects of thrust and decreasing weight, fighting against gravity and atmospheric drag, renewable technologies like solar and wind have seen their growth rates accelerate due to advancements in efficiency accompanied by massive decreases in production costs, as they fight against the drag of fossil fuel competition and market acceptance. And just like the rocket only reaches orbit if it has sufficient thrust, renewables can only overtake fossil fuels if their acceleration exceeds the acceleration of human energy consumption. This kind of exponential thinking is critical to understanding why renewable energy will play a pivotal role in our future energy systems, much faster than linear thinkers would suggest. As we discuss the transformation in energy production from fossil fuels to renewables, think of a growing crack or a launching rocket. Slow at first, then moving at speeds that redefine our understanding of what's possible. And for the younger people watching this episode, many of whom are really disappointed with the progress that's been made so far in fighting climate change, remember that exponential growth initially disappoints, but it then amazes people as it continues to accelerate. And I'm going to show you next that we're now transitioning into the amazement phase of the energy transition. So how do we predict what the amazement phase is going to look like? We can understand it by understanding the history of the energy transition in the power sector. This chart is really important, so I'm going to take a minute to describe it. I've taken the same data that we looked at earlier and replotted them using an exponential vertical axis. On an exponential plot like this, exponential growth becomes a straight line, with the slope of the line telling you the growth exponent. And the other thing I've done is separate the contributions of the three main flavors of renewables: hydropower, biofuels, and the intermittent renewables, wind and solar. The higher the slope, the greater the growth exponent. And you see here something really interesting. You see how renewable growth has been dominated for a long time by hydropower, and that hydro's slope is about the same as the slope of global energy demand growth. Biofuels have a slightly higher slope, but neither one of these technologies was going to catch up with global energy demand anytime soon. Using the rocket analogy, neither one has enough thrust to reach orbit. But look at the slope of wind and solar. I actually made this chart for the first time while I was writing a book about climate change, energy, and extreme poverty in 2015 during a career hiatus following my job at Irving Oil. Mitsubishi Power hired me as their CEO for the Americas before I could finish the book, but after seeing this chart, I knew it was time to start a career transition from natural gas to renewables and to lead my new team at Mitsubishi through the next phase of the energy transition. I hired a good friend of mine named Don Daniels, who had been chief strategy officer in another industry that had just lived through the same amazement phase of exponential growth, the telecommunications industry. With him and the existing team at Mitsubishi, we looked at how today's power grid was working, and we took a position on what would be necessary to really achieve a power grid that was dominated by wind and solar power. With our deep understanding of the role natural gas played in balancing supply and demand across multiple timescales, we decided the transition to wind and solar would only be possible if we also deployed energy storage at massive scale. And not just one type of energy storage, we were going to need energy storage of all durations, which I explained in the last episode of Power Play. After reviewing which parts of the value chain we were best positioned to go after in each of those areas, and understanding that we were going to need to keep paying the bills while we repositioned the business, we did a few things simultaneously. To pay the bills, we launched an initiative to increase our market share in natural gas power generation from the number 3 supplier to becoming the number 1 supplier, and to improve our service offerings to our existing customers. And to position ourselves for a massive future deployment of renewables and storage, we launched new businesses in utility-scale PV solar project development, utility-scale battery energy storage integration, and utility-scale green hydrogen infrastructure. The idea was that the new businesses would look small initially, but as exponential growth in renewables and energy storage occurred, would position us as players in these new high-growth industries. Fast forward to today, and the signs of exponential growth are all around us. 10 years ago, a really big PV solar project was 10 megawatts. 5 years ago, it was 100 megawatts. Today, it's a gigawatt. And in the wind space, the SunZia project in New Mexico just broke ground on a whopping 3+ gigawatt project with its own dedicated HVDC transmission line. And in lithium-ion battery storage, the story is similar. Here's an announcement that just came out that battery energy storage was the largest investment area in power generation last year. And I told you in last week's episode about the massive green hydrogen project under construction in Utah. And in episode 3, we talked about the exponential growth we're seeing in global electric vehicle sales. If wind and solar continue the same exponential growth rate in the next decade that they've followed for the past several decades, let's think about what the power grid will look like and compare it to today's power grid. I actually presented these charts for the first time a few years ago at Carnegie Mellon University's Energy Week conference in Pittsburgh. In today's power grid, we have baseload power sources like coal, nuclear, and hydro, and we have renewables making up a relatively small part of the overall power generation. And then we have dispatchable combined cycle natural gas power plants helping balance supply and demand, and we have peaker plants available to dispatch when the supply-demand balance gets really challenging. In a power grid without fossil fuels, it's going to look like this. We'll still have hydro and nuclear providing baseload power, but we'll now have renewables providing all the remaining energy we need, and then some. They'll have to overproduce what's needed because we're going to have to store a lot of the power that's produced so it's available when demand spikes and wind and solar are in short supply. Any kind of storage results in energy loss, with batteries being about 91% efficient and returning what they store, and essential long-duration energy storage solutions being much less efficient. As we envision this future, let's now address some of the hard truths that accompany such a transformation. If all of the energy loss associated with energy storage seems like a problem, let's remember the huge energy loss that occurs for fossil fuels in getting from primary energy to usable energy. A coal-fired power plant is about 40 to 45% fuel efficient. A combined cycle natural gas power plant is about 60% efficient, and gas peakers and internal combustion engines are about 35 to 40% efficient. So a large majority of the energy contained in fossil fuels is actually wasted as heat rather than converted to usable energy. The result is that we're actually going to need less renewable energy to meet total energy demand than we've needed from fossil fuels in the past, even after paying for the inefficiencies of energy storage. Another hard truth is that so far, we've been talking about energy storage to move renewable energy through time. Well, for the next phase, we're also going to need to think about moving renewable energy through space, and there will also be energy losses in this transportation. If we're going to build even larger multi-gigawatt renewable projects in the future, they're going to be located where renewable resources are the best, and these are very often far from demand centers, which we can understand better through visual data. Here's a picture of the U.S. taken at night over successive nights to remove cloud cover. The lights are a pretty good proxy for energy demand, and we can see how the major demand centers are east of the Mississippi and on the West Coast. Now let's superimpose the U.S.'s best wind locations on this. You can see the mismatch. And here's a chart of U.S. solar resources, and the poor wind and solar resources in the energy-hungry northeastern United States is particularly striking. We've already talked in previous episodes about the need for more electrical transmission to move power across continents in places like China and Texas. And electrical transmission also involves energy losses. But the other thing to consider is that we'll have to move some renewable energy between continents, just like we do today with fossil fuels. We'll move hydrogen molecules within continents via pipeline, but we won't move the hydrogen molecule from one continent to another. Instead, we'll convert it into other molecules that are easier to transport across oceans. A leading candidate is ammonia, and others are synthetic aviation fuel and methanol. And the hard truth here is that the energy penalty in this conversion is in addition to the steep energy penalty we already paid to produce green hydrogen. So we'll want to produce as much of our hydrogen within the same continent as possible. But there are some places like Japan, Korea, the northeastern US, and northern Europe where a constraint on land, poor renewable resources, and very high electrical demand are going to require them to supplement electrical transmission with imported renewable energy from other continents. And we have other areas like Australia, North Africa, the U.S. Gulf Coast, and the Middle East that have an incredible abundance of renewable power versus local demand. So we're going to have to pay a huge energy penalty to get renewables from places of abundance to places of deficit. But even with all these energy penalties associated with storage and transportation of renewable energy, we're still going to lose less energy delivering usable energy to users around the world than we currently do with fossil fuels. And now let's talk about the last hard truth of this episode. If you want to see what the implications of this growth are for the fossil fuel industries, well, here you go. Now, the reality of how this will work out is that exponential growth eventually gives way to an S-curve as the last, most challenging replacements for fossil fuel are tackled in parts of the world that are lagging others. So the tail end of fossil fuel use won't be as abrupt as what I've shown here. But if renewables keep their current growth exponent, a good guess at when fossil fuel consumption for energy will peak is around 2030. Keep in mind that energy only represents about 2/3 of fossil fuel demand, and I'm not making any prediction here about the pace of replacing fossil fuel use in chemicals, lubricants, and other uses. Well, that's a wrap for episode 8. I'll be tackling the Inflation Reduction Act in Washington, D.C. next week, and then on May 2nd, my wife and I are starting a 3-week drive from our winter home in Orlando to our summer home in San Diego, visiting with friends and hiking at a bunch of national parks along the way. We'll pass through the Permian Basin, and while we're in the area, I'll be doing an episode on the history of oil and gas production, so crucial to the U.S. economy of the past and present, and the future of wind and solar in the Permian, so crucial to their future. Then, in mid-July, my wife and I are leaving for a 3-month tour of Europe, Iceland, and Greenland, where I'll be doing more Power Play episodes. Well, thanks for watching. Please join me on the way out as we take a walk together in beautiful Central Florida. Let's go.